Welcome back into Pattrn. Earlier in the hour, we highlighted New York as one of the greenest states in the country, and they're making that mark by doing things like building more EV chargers and limiting energy consumption.
Yeah, but the Empire State has a long way to go before it hits its goals. Jeff St. John is the Director of News and Special Projects at Canary Media. He recently wrote an article about this issue, so thank you so much for being with us. And I guess we'll just start off with what New York's goals are to transition away from fossil fuels, and then we'll look at how are they going in terms of being on track or off track.
Well, thanks for having me. New York's climate law calls for a complete decarbonization of electricity and the broader economy all over the next 2.5 decades. That's an enormous pull, obviously. More recently, the state has been grappling with what to do about the use of fossil fuels in its buildings, which is a major contributor to greenhouse gas emissions in the state. And that's been a really fraught issue, given that natural gas is one of the key sources of building heating, obviously, and that it's going to be difficult to make that transition. But there's a package of laws now before the state legislature that is expected to take on some of those issues, including potentially banning the use of gas appliances, including cooking and heating in new buildings, and potentially taking on the issue of what to do about the state's gas utilities and the costs that they would incur on their customers to put in a bunch of new gas infrastructure and to rebuild and retrofit the pipes that they already have.
Yeah, that's the hard part, is the infrastructure to change everything, right? Which we've talked about in so many different ways. You mentioned gas. Now, your article also makes mention of the state's investment in renewable natural gas. What is RNG?
RNG is basically methane that you get off of rotting organic material. You can get it from landfills, you can get it from sewage treatment plants, you can get it from purpose-grown crops. And there are very limited amounts of that available today. A number of dairies are capturing it. And it's a good thing to capture off of dairies and landfills, because if it goes up into the atmosphere, methane is actually a very potent greenhouse gas. So it's better to capture it and do something with it than to let it just go off into the air. But there's a significant limitation to the scale that you can get to replacing fossil gas with renewable natural gas or biomethane or whatever you want to call it. There have been some studies, I believe a recent study from the New York State Energy Research Development Agency, NYSERDA, found that to replace the amount of gas that you're using now in New York with RNG would take about the same amount of cropland as the state has and then some. So limited application, but good for where it can be done.
And I know energy costs are going to fluctuate, obviously, if there's going to be less of this that you're talking about than what we have right now. But what can the consumer expect? I mean, I know we've got kind of a deadline here. Is there going to be much change in our pocketbooks?
Well, when it comes to gas, a lot has to do with how the transition is managed. Remember that utilities spend money to build stuff, and then they charge us, their customers, for the cost of building that stuff over decades into the future. So as gas, utility customers, we're paying for the stuff they did decades ago, and we will continue paying for the stuff they're building today, decades into the future. So that leads you to ask the question, should they be building a bunch of pipelines that might not be useful or used in the future as we make this transition? That's a big question. And one of the bigger questions is, how do you allow utilities to invest appropriate amounts to make sure that people who need gas can get it, and that people who can't afford to make the switch to electric heating systems like heat pumps aren't stuck with paying bigger and bigger bills as more and more people who can afford to get off the gas system do.
That's complicated.
It is complicated. What about thermal energy networks? Is that a viable solution for the problems that you've outlined, or how about the American Falls?
They're trying it out. Massachusetts has a couple of thermal energy network projects now underway, and New York has a bill that was passed last year that is going to order the state's gas utilities to try it out. And basically what you're doing there is you're taking pipes, but instead of running, fossil gas through them, you're using them to capture the ambient temperature deep underground, maybe 50, 100 feet. Kind of temperature stays the same there. And then you run a heat pump, which is like an air conditioner in reverse. And you use that stable temperature below to be, basically a sink or a source of heat to convert into heating up in your apartment or building.
Well, that is a process.
It is a process, but I mean, it'd be cool if we could figure out functionality, how everyone can do that. We really appreciate you kind of breaking all these down. I know it's a bit complicated, but we really appreciate your time. That's Jeff St. John, Director of News and Special Projects at Canary Media. Again, thank you so much. You guys can read Jeff's article at canarymedia.com.